Okay, this presentation is going to be a bit unusual. It's not about general politics. Generally speaking, I don't speak about Judaism a great deal. I do have some religious podcasts where I talk a little bit about Jewish faith, but I don't talk much about Jewish relationships with other people and other ideologies. Yesterday, however, I know I'm a bit behind the curve, but yesterday was Yom Hashoah. It's the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And the Holocaust Remembrance Day is a trigger both for memories and for mourning about what happened, but also for anti-Semitic reactions to what happened, in which case it is denied or it is something that is seen as a very good and positive thing. I want to speak to that. I want to talk about that through some of my own experiences with anti-Semitism and also through my understanding of why Jews perhaps should embrace some of the ideas and preconceptions that anti-Semites have about them. So I titled this presentation, the somewhat controversial title of Jews are the Enemy of Perfection, and that's a good thing. So let's step into it and see what we see. About 20 years ago, a little more than that actually, 25 years ago, I was in a laundromat in Waltham, Massachusetts. I was doing my laundry. As you can tell, I wasn't exactly the rich Uber Jew of some imagination. And a guy from the bar next door walked in. And there was only one door, kind of like this laundromat I have here, although it wasn't this one. He walked in, and I couldn't leave. And he was from the bar next door, and his friends were there just in case he needed backup. And he was angry. He was there to fight. He had seen that I was Jewish. I was obviously Jewish. And he wanted to confront me about the evils of Judaism. So his position was an interesting position. He was educated. He had studied Eastern philosophies. The idea of an harmonious society was very, very important to him. He'd read Plato, and he had read about Plato's idea of a society with complete coordination. And as he looked around the world, he saw one impediment to a better, perfect world. And that impediment was Jews. He was angry at us for not integrating, and he wanted to fight. But first, he gave me a chance to explain myself, to explain why we refused to get with the program. So I couldn't leave. And Massachusetts laws being what they were, although I had a carry permit, I couldn't have my gun on me, and I didn't. So we had to talk. His argument is actually a very, very old argument. This is a quote from the Book of Esther. And the Book of Esther is the case of the first recording of mass-scale anti-Semitism after the fall of the Jewish kingdom, the first Jewish kingdoms, and when they were under the control of the Persians. And Haman, the satrap, or it's not satrap, the prime minister of sorts for the king of the time, said there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among all the other peoples and all the provinces of your realm whose laws are different from those of any other people and who do not obey the king's laws, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. The Persian Empire was a confederation of sorts. It had many local governors, and those local governors reported to the central king, and they controlled geographic areas. They had a very harmonious, in a way, set-up system. It was a very enlightened ruler, a very enlightened empire established by Cyrus the Great. The problem was that the Jews were geographically dispersed, but were not legally beholden to the local geographically controlled legal systems. This is not actually such an unusual situation. In medieval Europe, what tribe of people you belonged to, if you're Frankish or something else, determined which legal system applied to you. Not where you were located, but what kind of person you were. So likewise, in the situation, the Jews did not share in the harmonious functioning of the empire because they didn't share in the legal system. So if we look a little bit further forward, we can see, a little further back initially, we can see a quote from the 5 books of Moses, from Deuteronomy. They have incited me to vengeance with a non-God, have spited me with their abominations, and I will incite them with a non-people. I shall anger them with a confused nation. The translation of confused can be played with a little bit, but that's the translation I'm going with here. When you talk about a non-people, people are established in modern times, oftentimes based on language. There's this idea of culture. Sometimes it's borders. But the thing that establishes a new people, that makes a non-people into a real people, is values and ideas. Ideas give the genesis for a nation. So the United States was born of ideas. And many other nations in Europe were born based on language, but those were pre-existing people. They just established a state. What I'm talking about here is the creation of a new people. And that happens through an idea. Of course, being that they're brand new nations, they're often confused, young, immature ideas that have not been seasoned with time and wisdom. So we end up with non-people pursuing the Jewish people, and they're confused. They're working off of very poorly baked ideas. So we saw this. This is one example. The Spanish Inquisition, quite famously, it expelled many Jews. It drove many into hiding. There were Jews who were showing up in the Arizona area centuries later who had been hiding for generations, for hundreds of years. Jews who went to Israel at that time, Jews who went to Turkey. Jews fled, and it was a tremendously catastrophic event for the Jewish people, in part because they had enjoyed a very good life under the Muslim rulers in Spain. Of course, it came and went. Sometimes it was horrible, sometimes it was great. But generally speaking, they were a very well established, very assimilated and connected part of the life in that area. The Catholic Spanish Empire came in, Aragon and Castile merged. They formed a new collective, this idea of Spain, and they wanted to have a perfect society in service of God, a perfect state. It was a beautiful vision. Spain was an ideological project. It's still one that's being sewn together. People don't necessarily identify as Spanish. We saw with the Castilian semi-rebellion a few years back. But their idea is that with this new concept, they could create the perfect Christian society. And of course, Judaism violated that vision. So Judaism had to be punished, constrained, limited in order to allow a properly harmonious society to emerge. And many European Christians for a long time shared this vision. One of the benefits of most American Christians is that they don't believe in this replacement theology where Jews are replaced and they have to be pushed out of the way or oppressed in order to provide this perfect society. American Christians often tend to be a little bit more accepting of variation despite with their reputation in the mainstream media. Another case is economic unity. The Soviets, who were often led by Jews, had this beautiful vision of a perfect state in perfect equality. The USSR was an ideological project. It wasn't a Russian one. The idea was to spread this idea, the Internationale, to spread this idea throughout the entire world. And of course, you had spin-offs in different countries. China is one that still, that party still rules things, although their communism is a little suspect. Once again, though, Judaism, even though many Jews were involved in this project, Judaism violated it. You could have some rituals going on. You could have a few things as long as you didn't believe in them too clearly, because you had to be a materialist. You had to be dedicated to this economic picture that the USSR was built on. And of course, many people on the left still share this vision of Jews as capitalist bloodsuckers who are out there to destroy the beautiful vision, the beautiful harmony that is offered by this communist ideal. And of course, you have racial unity. The Nazis had a beautiful vision for a perfect racial society, all Übermenschen everywhere you go. And the Jews, either through their physical attributes, through their behaviors, whatever it happened to be, they violated that image. They made that image so it couldn't be realized. And of course, many people on the right still share this vision, the idea that Jews violate the harmony that could be brought about through a more perfect government. The guy in the laundromat was probably a mix of all of these things. There's an interesting phenomenon, though. The societies that give birth to these ideas that hate Jews, that can't deal with Jews, are all built on one idea. It's a total idea, an idea that encompasses everything. And because of that, these societies lack dynamism. A dynamic society has ideas competing with each other. It's a living, organic, legal interaction that gives these societies life. But when you have only one purpose and one vision, you end up with a society that is very, very bad at adjusting to reality. And Jews, of course, don't tend to get with the program. So we tend to be a center of culture because we tend to provide dynamism. We tend to provide a counterpoint to what most of the culture is going through. Because new peoples are defined by new ideas, The new peoples are picking an idea, are pushing a single idea. That one idea is the thing that animates them, makes them real, that brings them to life. They attack those who don't fit into that idea. And so they attack Jewish people. And we've seen this many times. The Germans were a new people. The Spanish were a new people. The Soviets were a new people. And the Jews, Judaism, had to be attacked as a result of that. Now, the German example is not a one-step program. Germany was born in classic modern-day nationalism. You had in the mid-1800s all sorts of revolutions, all sorts of efforts to establish new definitions of nations by virtue of their language, by virtue of culture. And Germany was kind of a hodgepodge of many, many different statelets that were brought together into a single unified program, with the exception, of course, of Austria, which was a bit off to the side. But you had, generally speaking, a unified Germany on nationalist/linguistic ideas. This definition gave us World War I. It was a horrible war. It was a catastrophic war, but it was a war for national pride, but also for resources by a European latecomer. Germany was very, very full of people. The idea of needing more land was not entirely unreasonable. And they went to war, and they wanted to show that they were up to it, that they were a proud people. Of course, they had gone to war with Bismarck before and crushed France in a few weeks and done all sorts of things. But this was a new effort to advance the German cause. And at that time, there was no need to persecute Jews. It wasn't a new people based on an idea. It was a new people based on language, based on an affiliation these people had already had in place. And the Jews at the time, the vast majority of them, embraced the German idea. The Reform movement identified itself as German first and foremost, and Jewish was a secondary thing. To some degree, the Jewish rituals were kind of like the communists would have wanted it. They were there to be performed, to maintain some semblance of a cultural attachment to this particular subset of Germany, but they weren't things that were supposed to separate you from the German people. You were supposed to be a part of them, integrated with them as much as possible. Of course, World War I was lost. So Hitler gave Germany an ideological basis. Hitler took it to the next step. He built a racial origin story based on some very limited Roman texts, which described this very warlike, impressive people who lived off in the middle of nowhere. Who may or may not have been German-rooted at all, but he gave them that origin story. They were these Übermenschen, these great people, and of course he gave them a racial destination. Genetics was a new science at the time. Of course, they weren't working with genes quite yet, but they had the basic concepts in place. And the idea is that they were going to create a harmonious, superior society. This is a eugenics conference. I can't remember which one it was, the Second World Eugenics Conference or something along those lines. Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution, and it's got all of these ideas behind it, all these sciences behind it, all, well, exception religion maybe, sociology, medicine, surgery, psychiatry, politics, ethnography, archaeology, geology, all of it coming together into eugenics, which was going to, like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into an harmonious entity. It was going to provide harmony, this idea of eugenics. And it wasn't an idea that was uniquely German by any stretch of the imagination. It was supported as a good idea by progressives, including American Jews. It was, at the day, I don't know, the gay rights of the day, the idea that you have this obvious good, and we're going to promote it and push it. I'm not trying to say that gay rights isn't a good thing. What I'm suggesting is that this was the value that they were pushing at the time, and it was something that was extremely popular. So through this program, the U.S. actually ended up forcibly sterilizing over 60,000 people. The last of the sterilizations happened in 1981 in Oregon, where I'm from. And this was something that was accepted. It happened in 1981. So this eugenic concept was not something that was simply an outlier. It was a massive movement of the era. And in fact, Jews still practice a certain eugenic practice. When a couple wants to get married, they are often tested, and in ultra-Orthodox circles, it's required that they be tested to make sure that they're not both carriers for Tay-Sachs, because if they were, their children would have Tay-Sachs, and that would be a horrible thing. And so they're not allowed to get married if they fail that genetic test. The difference between the Jewish example and the American example and the Nazi example was that the Nazis made it their singular guide. It was the only thing that could determine what should happen in society. We can see this today with other ideas, the idea of love being a singular objective. If you make it a singular objective, people's love, people's happiness, whatever it happens to be, you actually end up creating other evils that you don't even see at first, but they're inherent because if you maximize one good, you have to take away from others. So there was a book published not long ago. As you can see, it was a New York Times bestseller. I haven't actually read the book, but I listened to a very extensive interview with the author, and it's called Black Earth. And the author was arguing that everything in the Nazi ideology was about race. The SS briefings prior to the invasion of Poland said, we're not about expanding Germany, we're about expanding the Aryan race, and we need to destroy everything we encounter in order to enable this to happen. We have to rip down everything that's pre-existing in order to allow race to emerge as the sole power, the sole force in human future. So the German law protected, when you looked at Germany, they protected other values and other rights. And laws are inherently about balance. They're about conflict and figuring out how you resolve those conflicts. And if you have one rule, you don't need much in the way of law. But if you don't have one rule, then you need law in order to counterbalance things. The famous Wannsee Conference, in which they defined what a Jew was about German Jews, because the German bureaucracy needed a legal framework within which to act. They couldn't just kill people on a suspicion of being Jewish. They had to have rules in order to do it. And in fact, they weren't even allowed to kill them in Germany. They had to export the Jews from Germany, not kill them on site. They had to follow certain legal conventions with Jews within Germany. By the time this conference occurred, over 90% of Latvia's Jews were already dead. They didn't need to be identified officially. They didn't need bureaucracy. They could just be machine gunned. So the rule of law, which in itself balances multiple different competing value systems, the rule of law protected against this evil. In Latvia, all the institutions were destroyed, first by the Soviets and then by the Nazis, and 99% of the Jews were killed. There were no protections. In Germany itself, the heart of Nazism, the institutions were undermined, but they were not destroyed, and only 50% of Jews died. And in Denmark, where all the institutions were preserved and remained, only 1% of the Jews died. So when you see the rule of law, when you see this idea of competing goods and competing ideologies, you actually end up with a society that doesn't allow an evil to overtake it. So competition of ideas, places that preserve competing ideas, even Germany itself, limit evil. Doesn't matter what your idea is. There's no idea that's totally good. Love is not totally good, as an example I gave before. Happiness is not totally good. You don't have economic equality is not totally good. There's no idea that cannot be and should not be balanced in some way. So when it comes to Jewish people, the Jewish people are described in the Torah as a stiff-necked people, twice, in two very close by readings. In one case, God says he wants to destroy them because they're stiff-necked people. They don't bend properly. They don't do what they're supposed to. At the same time, a little while later, after some negotiation back and forth and some definitions of how the Jews are going to work in the world and some change in their position with relation to God and the rest of the world, they are again described as a stiff-necked people, but this time it is given as a reason for why they should not be destroyed. They will not be destroyed. They will be preserved by God because they are a stiff-necked people. They're not going to give in and go away and assimilate, no matter what. So that is their great strength. It's a great weakness vis-a-vis God, but in a way, it's also their great strength because we will remain and we will stand up to whatever other ideology there is out there. Now, interestingly, it's a central belief. The central belief in Judaism is the belief in one God. But we don't believe in one value. In the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, there are two very obvious competing values. Of course, there are more than that, but two very obvious competing values, goodness and holiness. And those two values never overlap. When you look at the creation stories, I mean, everyone's familiar with the 7 days of creation, 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest, right? The word good is applied to everything but man, night, and it's applied to man sometimes, night, heaven, and the Sabbath. The Sabbath and the heaven are not called good. However, the Sabbath is called holy. So we have two different values that don't overlap, two different things. I'm not going to go into the definition of them now, but Jews have to seek both goodness and holiness, even though we can never maximize both of these things. Contradiction is built into Judaism, which is why we argue so much. But it's also why we resist overwhelming forces. And this is something that should be embraced. So in Judaism, there's a discussion, there's an idea that Jews embrace life, which is true. But life is not a singular value. in Judaism. We are supposed to give up our life rather than commit adultery, commit murder, or worship another god. So adultery is not trumped by life, interestingly enough, or worship another god. That's one there in there that's very, very important. What does worshiping another god mean? In the case, I think, gods are values. Gods are value systems. Gods are ideas. And when you worship another god, you're worshiping an incompatible value system. And where the gods of others demand the elimination of any of our Jewish values, they are totalitarian. Any value system that demands the elimination of other value systems is totalitarian. You don't necessarily have to accept or embrace or give free rein to other ideas. But if you eliminate them, then you are eliminating what is potentially, almost certainly, a source of goodness. Remember, even Jews test for Tay-Sachs. Even Jews support economic charity and support, helping each other out, or support capitalism. Right? You end up with values that each provide good things, and you can't simply eliminate one of them altogether. So Jews are allowed to sacrifice their life to fight totalitarian values, to fight something that excludes the practice of their religion and their faith in service of another. Now, of course, we come to this complex area of speech control. There's many Jews, unfortunately, who say, well, anti-Semitism is an absolute evil, so fighting it is an absolute good. We're allowed to ban speech, for example, and we see this on Facebook and Twitter and etc., in order to fight anti-Semitism. Now, I've got no problem banning speech that says kill X. That's a different action. That's a call to action. That's an incitement. But a speech that says Jews are bad, that shouldn't be banned. It's counterproductive. And of course, it's wrong. Because, its own way, it's totalitarian. It says that criticism of Jews is itself 100% evil. Well, of course, that can't be the case. Criticism of Jews, like criticism of anybody, is something that has its place. It might be something you want to limit. You don't want to say, hey, look at that ethnic group. They're totally good or they're totally bad. But nonetheless, you can examine things. You can look at things. And it can very quickly get very bad. But there's nonetheless, perhaps, reasonable ways in which you can criticize people for the way in which they act. The funny thing is that when you ban speech that criticizes Jews, and especially when you extend that idea to saying, so-and-so is Jewish, they're criticizing him because he's Jewish, therefore they're anti-Semitic. When in fact, they could just be criticizing so-and-so because they don't like what he's doing, they don't believe in what he's doing. By that definition, my mother, who passed away a little over a year ago, would be called anti-Semitic in many, many different ways because she was against many people who were Jewish and were prominent Jews, despite being from a very long and well-documented Jewish family and being a religious Jew herself. So what people say when they're from those areas, and I've grown up in those areas, it's not by accident that I run into people in laundromats, is that if Jews feel justified in prohibiting people from criticizing them, then the Jews themselves are acting in a totalitarian manner, and it's justifiable to resist them. Now, I obviously don't think there's a Jewish conspiracy, but the reason I don't think there's a Jewish conspiracy is not because Jews aren't overwhelmingly successful and overrepresented in all sorts of powerful and influential ways. The reason I don't think that there's an international Jewish conspiracy is because I know too many Jews, and Jews don't agree with each other. We go back to that stiff-necked people idea. We're going back here. We argue, we fight, we don't have a unified ideology, and so we can't actually form a very effective conspiracy. But that aside, when we try and ban speech that is anti-Semitic, we play into the hands of those who see us as totalitarians in our own way. I'm going to give you a very particular historical example. This is from Alan Borovy from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. In Weimar, Germany, during the 15 years before Hitler came to power, there were more than 200 prosecutions based on anti-Semitic speech. They had speech laws against hate speech. And in the opinion of the leading Jewish organizations of that era, no more than 10% of the cases were mishandled by the authorities. So they were very actively prosecuting anti-Semitic speech. So what happened? Well, in 1925, the state of Bavaria issued an order banning Adolf Hitler from making any public speeches. That's the end of Adolf Hitler, right? Except the Nazis responded by distributing a drawing of their leader with his mouth gagged and the caption of 2 billion people in the world, one alone is forbidden to speak in Germany. That was a very effective bit of propaganda because they were right. He was forbidden to speak in Germany. In a way, the people who were forbidding him were acting in a totalitarian manner. It's critical for Jews to play the part of a minority. We're not supposed to act in a totalitarian manner. We're supposed to stand out and disagree, sometimes just for the sake of doing so, just for the sake of being a davkinik, as they would say in Hebrew, or maybe Yiddish, I'm not sure. It's important to take that perspective because whenever there's a near perfect unity about any particular value system, even love or beauty or harmony, what results is evil. And so Jews enrich the society they're in by standing apart from it. This might be one reason, for example, why prior to World War II, Vienna was the center of world culture. Got rid of the Jews, they went to LA and New York, and LA and New York became centers of world culture. Because that approach of dissent is actually something that leads to tremendous cultural dynamism and is very beneficial to the societies that it's a part of. Let's go back to the man in the laundromat. I didn't report him for anything. In fact, we had about a 25-minute conversation. And I said two things to him. First, I calmed him down by showing that we prayed for universal peace. We didn't have in our interests the damaging of any other peoples. But then I argued that total harmony, the vision that he had, actually sucked the life out of society. And Jews' differences actually gave societies life. And at the end of our discussion, which was heated at times, but eventually quite cordial, he left friendly and deeply respectful. It was a very, very positive interaction. And by the way, not the only interaction of that form that I've had before. I had a similar thing with an Islamic terrorist in training on an airplane. I'll get to that another time. So the man in the laundromat was right. The Jews are the destroyers of harmony. But instead of denying people who accuse us of that, we should embrace it because it's a good thing. We have to argue against totalitarian ideas, whether they be Christian, fascist, communist, Islamic, or even Jewish. Because we weaken evil when we weaken efforts at total harmony. Of course, sometimes this involves speech. I don't think that you should fight speech with action, with violence, for example. But you should fight speech with speech, and you should fight action with action. And the goal is not to constrain people from having ideas. The goal is to argue and to enable many, many ideas to flourish and to flow within a society. And when you take away Jews from a society, you rob it of its core vitality, and that can lead to weakness and extremism. And likewise, I think when you ban any particular value system from being talked about, you actually end up weakening the society that you're a part of. Even if that idea is abhorrent to the vast majority of people in the society, it's something that should still be allowed to be talked about, even if people shun it or laugh at people who have those ideas. That's acceptable. But when you start using coercive force in order to ban the speech of things you find offensive, you actually end up with a society that's torn apart and becomes extremist. So let me go on to one very, very current day situation, the Wuhan respiratory syndrome. Yes, I'm calling it the Wuhan respiratory syndrome, and that may not be very popular, but hey, that's what we were just talking about. So in an emergency situation, life can be a singular goal. I think it's a laudable thing. But there's a risk that life becomes the norm as the only thing that we preserve, the only thing that we talk about. In that case, life becomes a god. As a religious person, I believe that God brought us death. And so life is not the absolute good. Instead, life has to be balanced with other values, just like everything else. Yes, life is near the top of the pyramid, but it has to be balanced with other values. And if you fail to do so, then you actually end up undermining living in the broader sense of the word. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, I wrote a story called The Cost of Life. It's an exciting dystopian story set in a post-corona world. It doesn't give any clear answers as to where the limits of life stand. It's a tough story, but it's a fun one. And you can find it on Medium at the address here. Thank you very much for listening. Here's some credits for the pictures that I used that weren't credited on the photos themselves. Thank you again. Bye.